Chapter 31. We dasn't stop again for any town for days and days. Kept right along down the river. We was down south in warm weather now, and a mighty long ways from home. We begun to come to trees with Spanish moss on 'em, hanging down from the limbs like long gray beards. It's the first time I ever see it growing. It made the woods look solemn and dismal. So now the frauds, they reckoned they was out of danger, and they begun to work the villages again. First they done a lecture on temperance, but that didn't make enough for them both to get drunk on. Then in another village they started a dancing school, but they didn't know how to do more than dance like a kangaroo does. So the first prance they made in the general public jumped in and pranced them out of town. Another time they tried to go at yellow woo. Let's just try that again. Another time they tried to go at yellowcution, but they didn't yellowcute long till the audience gave up and give them a solid good cussing and made them skip out. Well, they tackled missionarying, mesmerizing, doctoring, telling fortunes, and a little bit of everything, but they didn't seem to have no luck. So at last they just got about dead broke and laid around on the raft as she floated along, thinking and thinking, and never saying nothing. And by the half a day at a time, and a dreadful and blue, and it was desperate. And at last they took a change, begun to lay their heads together in the wigwam, and talk low and confidential for 2-3 hours at a time. Jim and me, we got uneasy. We didn't like the look of it. We judged they was studying up some kind of deviltry worse than ever. We turned it over and over, and last we made up our minds they was going to break into somebody's house or store, or was going to go into counterfeit money business or something. So then we was pretty scared. Made up an agreement that we wouldn't have nothing in the world to do with such actions. And if we was ever got the least show, we would give them the cold shake and clear out and leave them behind. Well, early one morning we hid the raft in a good safe place about 2 miles below a little bit of shabby village named Pikesville. And the king he went ashore and told us all to stay hid whilst he went up to town and smelt around to see if anybody had any wind of the royal nunsetch there yet. House to rob, you mean, I says to myself. And when you come back through robbing, you'll come back here and wonder what has become of Jim and me and the raft. And you'll have to take it out in wondering. That's what I says to myself. And he said if he weren't back by midday, the Duke and me would know it was all right, and we was to come along. So we stayed where we was. The Duke, he fretted and sweated around and was in a mighty sour way. He scolded us for everything, and we couldn't seem to do nothing right. He found fault in every little thing. Something was a-brewing, for sure. I was good and glad when midday come and no king. We could have a change, anyway, and maybe a chance for the chance on top of it. So me and the Duke went up to the village and hunted around there for the king. And by we found him in the back room of a little low doggery very tight, with a lot of loafers bully-ragging him for sport, and he a-cussing and a-threatening with all his might, and so tight he couldn't walk, and couldn't do nothing to him. Well, the Duke, he begun to abuse him too for being an old fool. The king began to sass back, and the minute they was fairly at it, I lit out and shook the reefs out of my mind and out of my hind legs, and spun down the river road like a deer, for I seen our chance, and I made up my mind it would be a long day before they ever seen me and Jim again. I got down there all out of breath, but loaded up with joy and sung out, "Set her loose, Jim! We're all right now!" But there weren't no answer, and nobody came out of the wigwam. Jim was gone. I set up a shout, and then another one, and run this way and that way into the woods, whooping and screeching. There weren't no use. Old Jim was gone. Then I sat down and cried. I couldn't help it. But I couldn't sit still for long. Pretty soon I went out on the road trying to think of what better to do, and I run across a boy walking. and I asked him if he'd seen a strange black man dressed so and so, and he said yes. I said, whereabouts, says I. Downside of Philip's house, 2 miles below here. He's a runaway slave, and they've got him. Was you looking for him? You bet I ain't, I says. I run across him in the woods about an hour or two ago, and he said if I hollered out he'd cut my livers out. Told me to lay down, stay where I was. And I done it. Been there ever since. Feared to come out. Well, he says, you needn't be feared no more, 'cause they've got him. He run off from down south summers. Well, it's a good job they got him. Well, I reckon there's $200 reward on him. It's like picking money up out of the road. Yes, it is. And I could have had it, I says, if I'd been big enough. I seen him first. Who nailed him? Well, it was an old feller, a stranger. He sold out his chance in him for $40 because he got to go up the river. Can't wait. Think of that. Now, you bet I'd wait. I'd wait if it was 7 years. Well, that's me every time, says I. But maybe his chance ain't worth no more than that. If he'd sell it so cheap, maybe there's something ain't straight about it. But it is, though. Straight as a string. I seen the handbill myself. It tells about him to the dot. Paints him like a picture. Tells the plantation he's from. Below New Orleans. No sirree, Bob. There ain't no doubt or trouble about that speculation. I bet you. Say, give me a chaw of tobacco, won't you? Well, I didn't have none, so he left. And I went down to the raft and sat down in the wigwam to think. But I couldn't come to nothing. I thought till I wore my head sore. But I couldn't see no way out of the trouble. After all this long journey, and after all we'd done for them scoundrels, here it all come to nothing. Everything was all busted up and ruined. 'Cause they could have a heart to serve Jim as a trick such as that? Make him a slave again all his life? And amongst strangers, too? For $40 dirty dollars. Once I said it to myself, it would be 1,000 times better for Jim to be a slave at home where his family was, as long as he'd got to be a slave. So I better write a letter to Tom Sawyer and tell him Miss Watson where he was. But soon I'd give that up that notion for 2 things. She'd be mad and disgusted at his rascality and ungratefulness for leaving her, so she might sell him right down the river again. If she didn't, everybody naturally despises an ungrateful slave, and they'd make Jim feel all the time. So he'd feel ornery and disgraced. And then he'd think of me. We'd all get around that Huck Finn helped a slave to get to his freedom. If I was ever going to see anybody from that town again, I'd be ready to get down and lick his boots for shame. That's just the way. A person does a low-down thing, then he don't want to take no consequences of it. Thinks as long as he can hide, it ain't no disgrace. That was my fix exactly. The more I studied about this, the more my conscience went to grinding me, the more wicked and down low and ornery I got to feeling. And at last, when it hit me all of a sudden, it was like the plain hand of Providence slapping me in the face, letting me know my wickedness was being watched all the time from up there in heaven. While I was stealing a poor woman's slave that hadn't done me no harm, and now was showing me there's one way that's always on the lookout. And that ain't going to allow no such miserable things to go on just fur and no further. I almost dropped in my tracks. I was so scared. Well, I tried my best to do kind of soften it up somehow for myself by saying I was brung up wicked, so I weren't much to blame. But something inside of me kept saying, there was a Sunday school. You could have gone to it. If you'd have done it, they'd have learnt you that there was people that acts as I've been acting about for those slaves that go, those people that goes to the everlasting fire. It made me shiver. And I about made up my mind to pray and see if I couldn't try to quit being the kind of boy that I was and try to be better. So I kneeled down. But the words wouldn't come. Why wouldn't they? It weren't no use to try and hide it from him, nor from me, neither. I knowed very well why they wouldn't come. It's 'cause my heart weren't right. It's because I weren't square. Because I was playing double. I was letting on to give up sin. But away inside of me, I was holding on to the biggest one of all. I was trying to make my mouth say I would do the right thing and the clean thing and go and write to that slave's owner and tell where he was. But deep down in me, I knowed it was a lie. And he knowed it. You can't pray a lie. I found that out. So I was full of trouble. As full as I could be. And I didn't know what to do. At last I had an idea. And I says, I'll go and I'll write the letter. And then I'll see if I can pray. Why, it was astonishing. The way I felt light as a feather, straight off, and my troubles all gone. So I got a piece of paper and a pencil, all glad and excited, and I sat down and I wrote, Miss Watson, your runaway slave Jim is down here 2 miles below Pikesville, and Mr. Phelps has got him, and he will give him up for the reward if you send Huck Finn. I felt good and all washed clean of sin for the first time I'd ever felt so in my life. I knowed I could pray now, but I didn't do it straight off, but laid the paper down and sat there thinking how good it was that all this happened so. And then that my friends got to call me in the middle of my stuff. Nate Clark, this one's going on you. It's going on you. Alrighty, so I'm not sure where we was, so I'm going to start the previous paragraph of where I think we was, which is where Huck sends Miss Watson that letter and signs it, Huck Finn. Well, I felt good and all washed clean of sin for the first time I'd ever felt so in my life. And I knowed I could pray now. But I didn't do it straight off, but laid the paper down and sat there, thinking how good it was all this happened so, and how near I come to being lost and going to hell. And I went on thinking. And I got to thinking over our trip downriver. And I see Jim before me all the time. In the night, in the day, sometimes in the moonlight, sometimes storms. We are floating along, talking and singing and laughing. But somehow, I couldn't seem to strike no places to harden me against him. Only the other kind. I'd see him standing my watch on top of his, instead of calling me, so I'd go on sleeping. I see how glad he was when I come back out of the fog. When I come to him again in the swamp. Up there and where the feud was. And such like times. And how he'd always call me honey and pet me and do everything he could for me. And how good he always was. And at last I struck the time I saved him by telling the men that we had smallpox, and he was oh so grateful. He said I was the best friend old Jim ever had in the world, and the only one he's got now. And I happened to look around, and I see that paper. It was a close place. I took it up and held it in my hand. I was a-trembling, because I'd got to decide, forever, betwixt 2 things, and I knowed it. I studied a minute, sort of holding onto my breath, and then I says to myself, all right then, I'll go to hell, and I tore it up. It was awful thoughts, and awful words, but they was said, and I let them stay said. And I never thought no more about reforming. I shoved the whole thing out of my head. And I said I'd take up wickedness again. Which was in my line. I was brung up to it. And the other weren't. And for a starter, I would go to work and I'd steal Jim out of slavery again. And if I could think up something worth to do, I'd do that too. because as long as I was in, and in for good, I might as well go whole hog. So then I set to thinking over how to get at it, and turned over some considerable many ways up in my mind, and at last fixed up a plan that suited me. So when I took the bearings of a woody island that was down the river a piece, and as soon as it was fairly dark, I crept out with my raft and went for it, and hid it there. And then I turned in, and I slept the night through. And I got up before it was light, and had my breakfast, and put on my store clothes, and tied up some others, and one thing or another in a bundle. And I took the canoe, and I cleared for shore. I landed below where I judged was the Phelps place, hid my bundle in the woods, then filled the canoe up with water, and loaded her with rocks, and sunk her where I could find her again if I wanted her, about a quarter mile below a little stream sawmill that was on the bank. And then I struck up the road. And when I passed the mill, I see a sign on it. It says Phelps Sawmill. And when I come to the farmhouses, 200 or 300 yards further along, I kept my eyes peeled, but I didn't see nobody around. There was a good daylight now, but I didn't mind, because I didn't want to see nobody just yet. I only want to get the lay of the land. According to my plan, I was going to turn up there from the village, not from below. So I just took a look, shoved along straight for town. Well, the very first man I see when I got there was the Duke. He was sticking up a bill for the Royal Nonsuch. 3-night performance, just like the other time. They had the cheek, them frauds. I was right on him before I could shirk. He looked astonished and says, "Well, hello! Where'd you come from?" And then he says, kind of eager and glad, "Where's the raft? You got her in a good place?" And I says, "Well, that's just what I was going to ask your grace." Well, then he didn't look so joyful, and he says, "Well, what's your idea of asking me?" "Well," I says, "when I see the king was in that doggery yesterday, I says to myself, we can't get him home for hours till he's soberer. So I went a-loafing around to town to put in the time and wait. And a man up and offered me 10 cents to help him pull a skiff over the river and back to fetch his sheep. So I went along. But when we was dragging him to the boat, and the man left me a hold of the rope and went behind him to shove him along, he was too strong for me and jerked loose and run. We after him. We didn't have no dog, so we had to chase him all over the county till we tired him out. We never got him till dark, and then we fetched him over, the sheep I mean, and I started down for the raft. When I got there, I see it was gone. I says to myself, well, they've got into trouble and had to leave. And then they took my slave, which is the only slave I've got in the world. Now I'm in a strange country, ain't got no property no more, nor nothing, no way to make my living. So I sat down and cried. I slept in the woods all night. But what did become of the raft then? And Jim, poor Jim. Well, blamed if I know. That is, what's become of the old raft. But that old fool made a trade and got $40. And then when we found him in the doggery with the loafers and had matched the $half with him and got every cent but what he'd got for the whiskey, when I got him home late last night, we found the raft gone. We said, that little rascal stole our raft, and then shook us and run off down the river. Well, I wouldn't shake my slave, would I? It's the only slave I had in the world. It's my only property. Well, we never thought of that. Fact is, we'd come to consider him our slave. Yes, we did consider him so. Goodness knows we had enough trouble for him. So when we see the raft was gone, and we flat broke, there weren't anything to do but to try the Royal Nonsuch for another shake. And I've pegged along ever since, dry as a powder home. Where's that 10 cents? Get here. Well, I had considerable money, so I gave him 10 cents, but begged him to spend it for something to eat, and give me some, because it was all the money I had. And I ain't nothing to eat since yesterday. But he never said nothing. Next minute he whirls on me and says, you reckon that slave would blow on us? We'd skin him if he done that. Well, how can he blow? Says I. Ain't he run off? No. That old fool sold him and never divided with me. The money's gone. Sold him? Says I. And I begun to cry. Well, he was my slave. That was my money. Where is he? I want my slave. Well, you can't get your slave, that's all. So just drop your blubbering. Looky here. You think you'd venture to blow on us? Blame if I think I'd trust you. Why, if you was to blow on us... He stopped. But I never seen the Duke look so ugly out of his eyes before. And I went on and whimpered and said, I don't want to blow on nobody. I ain't got no time to blow, nohow. I got to turn out and find my slave. He kind of looked bothered and stood there with his bills fluttering on his arm, thinking, and wrinkling up his forehead. And at last he says, well, I'll tell you something. We got to be here 3 days. If you promise you won't blow, and you won't let your slave blow, I'll tell you where to find him. So I promised, and he says, farmer by the name of Silas And then he stopped. You see, he started telling me the truth. But when he stopped that way, he began to study it and think it again. Change. I reckon he was changing his mind. And so he was. He wouldn't trust me. He wanted to make sure of having me out of the way for the whole 3 days. So pretty soon, he says, the man about him's name is Abram Foster. Abram G. Foster. He lives 40 miles back here in the country, on the road to Lafayette. All right, I says, I can walk that in 3 days. I'll start this very afternoon. No, you won't. You start now. And don't you lose no time about it neither. Nor gabbling along the way. Just keep a tight tongue in your head and move right along. And you won't get into any trouble with us. You hear? That was the order I wanted. And that was the one I was playing for. I wanted to be left free to work my plans. So you clear out, he says. You can tell Mr. Foster whatever you want to. Maybe you can get him to believe that Jimmy is your slave. Some idiots don't require documents. These ways I've heard there's such down here in the South. When I tell him, and when you tell him the handbill and the reward's bogus, maybe he'll believe you. When you explain to him what got the idea was for getting him out. Go along now. Tell him anything you want to. But mind you don't work your job between here and there. So I left and struck for the back country. I didn't look around, but kind of felt like he was watching me. But I know I could tire him out at that. So I went straight out in the country as much as a mile before I stopped. And then I doubled back through the woods toward Phelps's. I reckon I'd better start in on my plan straight off without fooling around. Because I wanted to stop Jim's mouth till these fellows could get away. I didn't want no more trouble with their kind. I'd seen all I wanted to with them. I wanted to get entirely shut of them.